Hello, Wonder. Tonight we're not chasing stars nor scaling peaks. Instead, we'll follow a slower path, one drawn in sand and wind and footnotes of silence. This isn't the desert of urgency, but of trivia, of soft rhythms, and of stories that arrive late and leave earlier still. Somewhere in the Gobi, a bamboo flute forgotten on a dune lets the wind speak through it. Just once, just enough. Not to impress, but to remember. A caravan dozes in shadow. A clerk counts what no one asked him to. And a camel exhales like paper being turned in a book that's mostly margin. The night here doesn't begin with darkness, but with the heat retreating grudgingly, like a baker, hiding bread in his coat. As you listen, you'll meet a lizard whose scales mirror legends, and a silence that makes room for nonsense, parables, and tea. An inn will appear, not as destination, but as punctuation. There, oil from forgotten grapes glides across green tea, and chopsticks throw polite shadows on painted wood. Later still, a gong will ripple the sand, and a blank page in a silk bound. The journal will welcome the first light as if it's an old friend. So dim your light, place your earphones gently, and if possible, sit near an open window. The wind might still be carrying the flute's last note, and who knows, maybe tonight, it's playing just for you. Asterisk, you might not think a bamboo flute. Abandoned on a dune could tell us very much about 13th century trade routes, yet here we are, listening to it sigh through a hole the size of a barley grain. The Gobi night is only just unclenching. Sand still holds the day's heat like a baker hiding a loaf in his apron, and Marco Polo's small caravan has paused to let the darkness settle. A minor Venetian clerk, whose name history does not trouble to record, sits counting saddle stitches instead of stars, muttering totals no one asked for. A camel sneezes so softly it sounds like parchment rustling in a distant archive. The wind in this part of the Gobi is tuned to the key of slow forgetting. Every few heartbeats it drags across the mouth of that orphan flute, and the note it spills is neither sharp nor flat, just a patient in-between hum, like the sound a wine glass makes when a dinner guest you no longer remember decides to test its resonance. Marco claims the instrument belonged to a Tangut shepherd who traded it for mirrors, though mirrors do seem unnecessary when the desert provides reflective curves of silver sand at dawn. Speaking of reflections, a Persian scribe in the party insists on noting the number of grains that collect in his inkwell each hour 32 at dusk. 31 by moonrise. Apparently the Gobi knows how to keep even trivia on a polite schedule. Somewhere beyond the camp, the dunes continue shifting, executing choreographies that geographers will measure centuries later with laser altimeters. The label minor Aeolian ripples, as if the earth were merely doodling during a long lecture. For the next moment or two, you may enjoy the fact that Polo's caravan carried exactly 9 spare camel bells, each tuned differently to reduce boredom. The idea was borrowed from Kashgar merchants who treated bells like paragraphs ring 1 for a new subject, 2 in quick succession for a digression. According to an almost trustworthy ledger found in a Genoese attic, bell number 7 was used only once, to announce a debate over whether scorpion venom could be used as ink. The verdict, scratched into a wax tablet now lost, wasn't unhopeful. Perhaps. Around them, the flute's note drops lower, turning the air into warm silk, and our first quarter drifts away like a merchant who realizes his bags are closed, but cannot remember why he opened them. A lizard appears at the edge of the firelight, its scales reputed to be as transparent as cathedral glass. Local legend says the creature carries a map of hidden wells in the pale threads beneath its skin. Scholars later discover those threads are simply veins, but that does not stop storytellers from charging a small fee to view them. Marco's interpreter, whose beard collects more sand than most coastal beaches, swears he once saw a caravan follow such a lizard for 3 nights. only to find the fourth night had politely declined to arrive, leaving them trapped in endless twilight until they apologized for their impatience. This, he explains, is why you must never rush a desert. The lizard remains perfectly still, blinking with the slowness of old planets. Marco, keen on cataloging everything, counts the blinks 12 in the first hour and wonders if there is a code. One blink could mark copper caravans, 2 for silk convoys, 3 for unlikely romances between rival spice traders. A traveling monk observes that future naturalists will label the species Lacerta vitrum, only to argue later whether it ever existed outside exhausted imaginations. By then, textbook diagrams will depict it in tasteful gray, which rather defeats the gloss metaphor but pleases printing presses that disdain vibrant inks. Tiny facts like these float through the campfire smoke, attaching themselves to dreams the way burrs cling to traveling cloaks. You would think the desert, with its reputation for silence, might protest this accumulation of trivia, yet it obliges by recording nothing, as usual. A single grain lands on Marco's silk journal, another on the lizard's tail, and somewhere, an hourglass sighs because nobody invited it on this journey. If at this point your thoughts wander, consider that the average steppe breeze travels slower than a leisurely messenger pigeon, yet it manages to narrate centuries of caravan gossip without once mispronouncing anyone's name. That takes practice. The glass-scaled lizard finally slips away, leaving exactly 3 footprints, which tomorrow's cartographer will mistake for punctuation and place at the end of a sentence about mirages. All punctuation is optional here, even full stops. An inn materializes like courteous punctuation in the vast, unending sentence of sand. Lanterns swing under its eaves, each flame curling upward as though it would prefer to read scrolls stored in the rafters. Inside, oil from turf and grapes glides across the surface of green tea, tracing shapes reminiscent of small maps, or possibly music notes composed for travelers too tired to play them. Marco counts the droplets. He is fond of counting and quietly ranks them by viscosity. The innkeeper, who labels every jar in 3 languages to appear scholarly, pours another cup and murmurs that one of his teapots once belonged to a minister who never used it, fearing the tea leaves might overhear state. Secrets. Somewhere near the hearth, a minor clerk attempts to sketch the shadows cast by chopsticks, only to notice that shadows here behave politely, never overlapping without formal introductions. This discovery will later inspire a footnote in a Venetian Merchant's Manual on Diplomatic Etiquette under the heading Observations from Avenues of Utter Irrelevance. Outside, camels doze, standing up, their silhouettes resembling punctuation marks that forgot where the sentence was going. The inn's walls are plastered with poems written by guests who mistakenly believed they could improve upon the silence. Most poems mention sand, some mention moonlight. A brave few mention the innkeeper's cat, which refuses to chase mice unless paid in dried apricots. Oil lamps dim and brighten in agreement with distant winds. A Chinese astrologer in the corner announces that tonight's star arrangement resembles a ledger balanced to the copper coin. A good omen for merchants, but somewhat dull for romantics. Marco nods, records this, then doodles a small compass rose. Beside it, an embellishment he will later claim was necessary for narrative flair. Should you happen to still be awake, notice how the tea's surface tension alters when someone whispers. Scholars in later centuries will attempt to design listening. Devices based on this, achieving only a series of mildly damp notebooks. Before dawn lifts its faint silver lid, a gong from a remote temple rolls over the dunes as if the horizon has decided to stretch and tap its own edge. The sound arrives slowly, picking up stray thoughts like a porter gathering forgotten scarves, and lays them gently among the sleepers. Marco's silk journal is already open to a blank page, awaiting first light. In that dim hush, He scribbles a note about the way camel tracks resemble lines of cursive practice, then pauses to observe how his ink thickens in the chill. He will later attribute this to mystical forces rather than simple night air, because mystical forces sell better in Venice. Meanwhile, a hired guard discovers that Dawn smells faintly of pomegranates, perhaps from a lost crate buried nearby centuries before. He decides not to report this aroma, fearing it might be taxed. A sparrow, puzzled to find itself so far from the nearest cypress, perches on the journal long enough to leave a signature feather. Scholars in a modern lab will carbon date that. Feather declare its age insignificant, and move on to lunch, proving that not every artifact receives a climax. The first ray of sunlight sneaks under the inn's door, politely wipes its feet, and advances across the floorboards until it lands on Marco's incline, turning the black into a brief glimmer of bronze. He regards this as confirmation that the journey is blessed, or at least that the sun enjoys a practical joke. Far away, the wind flute buried in last night's dune offers one final note, lower than before, sounding rather like a librarian exhaling. At closing time, the caravan begins to stir. Someone counts saddlebags, someone else counts reasons to delay. None of it matters to the sand, which is already rewriting footprints into something resembling gentle waves. If a temple gong can ripple through stone corridors hundreds of li away, perhaps these quiet sentences can drift across your own thoughts, nudging them toward the soft edges of sleep. No tally sheets, no glass-scaled riddles, just the calm arithmetic of hoofbeats and tea droplets, folding themselves into the blank space between heartbeats. The journal page brightens, then turns ordinary white, ready to accept whatever small, slow observation comes next, but you do not need to follow it. Let the sound recede like breath drawn back into a flute. The desert continues whispering trivia to itself, and the dunes, mercifully patient, are willing to repeat everything tomorrow if you've already forgotten. You may not expect the humble clop of a Georgian male coach horse to reveal anything profound about empire. Yet listen closely, and each hoofbeat politely measures exactly 1/5 of a regulation mile. The London evening is settling onto its chimneys like a cat deciding which roof tile is warmest, and somewhere beyond Highgate Toll, a driver called Mr. Fairweather rehearses the official requirement to average 8 miles an hour. No more, no less. He counts aloud 1, 2, 3, then stops at 4 because that is the distance a letter was once believed to travel before its seal remembered a forgotten secret. If you are somehow still awake by the moment I describe the varnish on the coach's 4th lantern, you are welcome to subscribe, though I would hate to see you waste so fine a drowsiness on mere curiosity. The regulation derives from the Post. Office Act of 1784, written on calfskin that still smelled faintly of patient meadows. Parliament, concerned that correspondence might arrive either too suddenly or too late for gossip to retain flavor, decreed a speed balanced between urgency and decorum. This produced an unexpected side effect. Drivers began training ears, not eyes, to judge distance. They learned that a horseshoe on damp gravel sounds like a teacup set gently on a saucer, whereas on dry chalk it resembles the sigh of a footman unbuttoning gloves. One enterprising coachman claimed he could detect imperial news simply by tempo faster for war dispatches, slower for inheritance claims. Scholars later proved this untrue, yet copied the anecdote into footnotes because footnotes enjoy exaggeration. It gives them a reason to exist. The night deepens, wrapping the hedgerows in a velvet so plush even the constellations feel underdressed. And the coachman's counting falls into rhythm with your breathing. We arrive at the Red Line coaching, and where lanterns hang like question marks that never receive answers. Each glass pane bears a Roman numeral indicating its position on the coach. I for front left, 2 for front right, 3 for rear left, 4 for rear right. This numbering system was introduced after a brief but memorable confusion in 1791 when two lamps swapped brackets during a hailstorm, causing passengers to believe the coach was traveling sideways. Inn records describe the incident with remarkable restraint, noting only moderate public amusement. Inside, the booking clerk, Miss Penfold, tracks arrivals by scratching lines on a slate. 5 scratches per hourglass turn, though her hourglass leaks slightly on cold nights, making time itself seem indecisive. She compensates by humming ballads in sets of 23 bars, apparently, the number that best approximates a legally correct mile when sung in soprano. No one questions her method. After all, the mail must move, and humming is cheaper than CHROMETERS. In a corner, a junior postboy oils the brass fittings of tiny padlocks used on letter bags. He counts the drops, 1 per hinge, then politely labels each bottle of oil with the date of winter solstice for no reason whatsoever. Future catalogers will puzzle over this, attributing it to a chemical superstition or perhaps a private joke. Such puzzles drift through lamplight like motes you can almost focus on almost, but not quite until they settle on your eyelashes and persuade them closed. The fireplace ticks as logs shift. Somewhere behind the bar, a goose quill pen snaps in half due to boredom, a reminder that even stationery can grow weary of precision. Past midnight, our mail coach departs again, rolling toward St. Albans along rutted lanes the color of forgotten plums. Each furlong marker wears a frosted wig of moonlight, making them appear like judges passing silent verdict on punctuality. The driver recites his timetable: 10 minutes to the next turnpike, 3 to pay the keeper, 5 to adjust the harness. Of a horse notoriously skeptical of milestones. This meticulous recitation has a soporific cadence. Indeed, some passengers claim to sleep better to schedule recitals than to lullabies. You may notice the interior upholstery is dye-a-shade known as post office crimson, chosen because it hides ink stains from clerks finishing ledgers en route. The dye's recipe remains classified so secret, legend says, that only one dyer knew it at any given moment, and the knowledge was passed on a scrap of paper folded into a swan, which was then ceremoniously dunked in tea, rendering it illegible. Historians delight in such pointless security measures. They give conferences something to debate between cups of weak coffee. Near Watford, a drizzle begins, the sort that doubts its own purpose. Rain on the coach roof produces a rhythm faintly, resembling a harpsichord practice from the next house over. Drivers interpret this as a sign to check axle grease. You may interpret it as an invitation to drift further inward, where thoughts grow soft and slow. The guard seated atop the rear boot blows his horn exactly twice at each parish boundary, a courtesy codified in 1803 to notify tollkeepers of approaching revenue. His breath clouds like small ghosts, then fades before completing any haunting. Many years later, phonographers will attempt to capture this horn on wax cylinders. They will succeed only in recording the rustle of their own overcoats. Yet libraries preserve these silent cylinders, cataloged under potential sound artifacts, a category beloved by curators who enjoy labeling silence. Dawn considers appearing but chooses delay, as if rifling through wardrobes for the right shade of gray. The mail coach finally reaches General Post Office North Road headquarters, where clerks in ink-stained smocks sort bags beneath skylights that admit the day in fractions. Each sack is slit with a penknife whose ivory handle bears the name of a long-retired postmaster famous for inventing the phrase, reasonable haste. Letters tumble out like polite confessions receipts for parsley, invitations to delayed weddings, one urgent request for extra violin rosin. Clerks pivot on tiny brass wheels embedded in their heels, an ergonomic experiment abandoned after 3 months, yet still executed by habit. They tally stamps by candle steps because sunrise, though imminent, should never be rushed. Somewhere a ledger brims with numerals so drowsy they lean against each other for support. Accountants call this column fatigue, though remedies remain elusive. A junior auditor, barely 16, is tasked with recording the exact weight of empty mailbags, an average of 13 ounces, unless damp, then 14. He adds a note that goose quills squeaked more at that weight, a scientific breakthrough destined to be filed under irrelevant observations, keep nevertheless. Outside, sparrows debate whether scarlet uniforms make better nesting material. Man, straw. Their argument drifts through the half-open clerestory window and settles on stacks of unstamped letters, imparting a faint chirp to the scent of sealing wax. Years from now, philatelists examining those envelopes will insist they detect avian undertones, proving that sleep, like postage, travels farther when lightly feathered. The final scene unfolds as sunlight at last spills across marble floors, turning ink pools bronze and revealing footprints of invisible cats that wandered through during the night. Clerks extinguish candles by pinching wicks with moistened fingertips, a technique perfected to produce the softest possible hiss. The master of mails signs off the night register with a flourish that resembles a sleeping hedgehog. He takes pride in that resemblance and closes the ledger on a velvet ribbon dyed in that secret crimson. The book's clasp clicks shut, a sound many claim to find more soothing than any lullaby, for it signals the precise moment all accounts balance, all journeys pause, and every unanswered letter rests in orderly anticipation you need not follow. The paperwork further. Let the gentle arithmetic of hoofbeats and raindrop harpsichords continue without you. Somewhere along the North Road, a new driver is already counting paces under his breath, but the numbers soften, merge, and slip away like ink sinking into cotton rag. In their place comes the hush of stacked ledgers settling for the day, a hush big enough to cradle even the most stubborn wakefulness. If a distant horn should call again, it will sound less like duty and more like a lull in conversation, inviting you to close the ledger of your own thoughts until the next gentle page is due to turn. You may not suspect that an argument about the precise redness of a cast iron pillar box could last longer than a small war. Yet the British Post Office managed that very feat between the summers of 1856 and 1874. Somewhere on a drizzly Thursday, the first committee convened beneath sputtering gas lamps, examining swatches so similar they looked like consecutive blushes on a shy tomato. If you find yourself still alert once I recite the 7th official name for crimson, feel entirely free to subscribe. Though I do admire anyone who prefers unconsciousness to etymology. The inaugural shade, officially titled Euston Vermilion, owed its birth to a paintmaker who claimed he could bottle punctuality. Samples arrived in tiny tins wrapped with twine, whose knots were tied exactly 3 finger breadths apart, a measurement believed to reduce spillage through superstition rather than science. One clerk recorded that opening the tin sounded like someone whispering the word hurrah into a handkerchief. Trials began on Camden High Street. 3 boxes painted, 3 months observed. Postal data revealed no discernible change in collection punctuality, but milkmen reported the boxes encouraged dairy cows to produce creamier milk evidence, later dismissed as unrelated, yet copied dutifully into footnotes because footnotes, like house sparrows, flock anywhere crumbs of absurdity are scattered dot by 1860. The committee met again, insistent that Euston Vermilion looked dreary beneath coastal fog. They considered scarlet euphonium, so named because its inventor tested pigment vibrancy by holding brass instruments beside fresh coats and assessing tonal resonance. A junior assistant timed these experiments with a pocket watch whose balance wheel ticked at precisely 4 hertz coincidentally, the tempo at which many listeners now drift toward sleep. During field tests in Portsmouth, a sailor mistook a newly painted box for the rear light of an idle tug and saluted it for 8 consecutive evenings. The postal board feared further nautical confusion, so scarlet euphonium was quietly shelved, though the tins remained in storage, each one labeled, perhaps. Halfway through the decade, debate drifted toward chemistry. A dye called Matter No 12 offered durability but faded under gaslight to what critics described as melancholy salmon. A parliamentary inquiry compared sample panels under 27 varieties of flame, ranging from whale oil to candle stubs made of beef tallow, some curled, some straight, all smelling faintly of philosophical despair. Observers annotated wax strip patterns with such devotion that records still preserve. Phrases like dribble suggests indecision, beside swirls resembling sleepy question marks. One member of parliament proposed simply painting every letter, box of different hue, thereby guaranteeing at least one correct shade at all times, but logistics subjected and budget side. The minutes of that meeting conclude with a remarkable remark. Consensus postponed until after tea of indefinite strength. The search for permanence led chemists to add lead to the pigment, producing a color both brilliant and mortally toxic. Workers at the Holloway Road foundry wore improvised masks stitched from postal sacks. Despite precautions, several began speaking in rhymed couplets at odd hours. Physicians attributed this to fume inhalation, though some suggested the effect merely revealed latent poetic tendencies. Either way, the committee worried verses might appear unsolicited on envelopes, upsetting the tariff for printed matter. Leaded Red was abandoned, but the incidental poetry survives in a warehouse ledger now cataloged under occupational lyricism, where you may read lines such as, "O bolt of brass, keep hinge from rust, and guard the rhyme in molten crust." Scholars quote these stanzas when lectures need gentle eccentricity. If your eyelids are settling as snugly as a penny in a slot, the poets would surely approve. Winter of 1870 introduced Indian Red Revised, a tint stable under coal smoke, yet suspected of attracting street urchins who use newly painted boxes. As improvised blackboards, scratching out cricket scores in chalk. The committee therefore tested reflectivity by observing reflections of a lamplighter's ladder at 20 paces, an experiment ultimately inconclusive because the lamplighter, named Mr. Tudge, refused to stand still in temperatures below 5 degrees Celsius. His jittering image produced data too jittery in sympathy. Nevertheless, charts were drawn, lines plotted, and a subcommittee appointed to review the ratio of chalk dust to postal throughput. They concluded earnestly that any hue inspiring arithmetic on public property must contain optimistic undertones, and optimism, while commendable, risked unrealistic expectations of delivery speed. Chalky enthusiasm was thus deemed operationally. Hazardous one might imagine these meetings loud. In fact, they whispered as if louder voices might smear the paint by vibration alone. The chairman, Sir Hobart Twistleton, spoke no sentence exceeding 12 syllables, believing brevity prevented escalation. He carried color cards in a walrus hide folio scented faintly of linseed and regret. Between agenda items he polished. Monocle and mustache with the same cloth. This dual use recorded in margins by a clerk who struggled to catalog etiquette violations within standard rubric. That clerk, Miss Lively, also noted the average heartbeat of attendees 60 beats per minute, precisely the rate at which viewers of this series tend to slide into deeper rest. Should your pulse follow theirs, allow yourself the luxury dot at last. In July 1874, consensus hardened like paint on iron. The chosen formula, deep post office red, balanced visibility, dignity, and resistance to damp Lancashire air. Final tests involved positioning 3 boxes along a railway embankment, then observing them from a moving train while sipping weak tea, a procedure specified to mimic everyday perception. Reports describe the color as sober yet welcoming, neither boastful nor bashful. To celebrate, the committee adjourned for the final time, but someone forgot to extinguish 3 steady candles. Their wax dripped onto a parchment of rejected shades, blending pigments into a muted mauve quite unlike any candidate. An observer suggested jokingly that future generations might prefer mauve. The jest was recorded, footnoted, and eventually cited by 20th century designers when proposing pillar boxes in modern tones. History, like paint, peels, and layers, each revealing yesterday's laughter dried into today's fact dot with decision reached. Tins of deep post office red traveled by rail and barge to depots nationwide. Carters stacked them like scarlet coins, each stenciled with batch numbers corresponding to minutes of the approval meeting, a final, sleep-inducing flourish of clerical neatness. Painters received instructions to stir 9 clockwise turns before each application, a ritual rumored to align molecules in patriotic formation. Whether this worked remains unproven, but diaries attest that some painters counted under their breath in lilting cadence identical to nursery rhymes. Children nearby fell silent, lulled by the rhythm of swish and tap, until the newly crimson pillar stood drying like a sentinel awaiting letters, and dreams dot sunrise over Fleet Street glimmered on rows of fresh boxes, each indistinguishable from its neighbor in the way meadow grass seems identical until wind reveals subtle wavering personalities. A postman named Mr. Flood conducted an informal experiment, knocking gently on 50 boxes to gauge tone. He described the sound as copper kettles discussing theology. No data derived, yet his observation found its way into the postal gazettes. Miscellany column, which printers set in smaller type expressly to tire the eye. Late-night readers of that column often reported drifting to sleep mid-sentence, convinced they had learned something substantial, though unable to recall what. Ended the great color debate, not with acclaim, but with the mild satisfaction of paperwork completed. Paint tins emptied, brushes cleaned, committees dissolved like sugar in tea. The red endured, fading slowly to pink under sea winds, darkening under soot, but always, somehow, exactly the right roundness to draw the wandering envelope home, if an occasional hue drifted toward orange or slipped into burgundy. It merely added footnote fodder for future historians, perhaps students of this very series, who will measure flakes beneath microscopes and argue anew. By then you, comfortably adrift, will have forgotten the hierarchy of reds, remembering only the hush of whispered committees and the distant scrape of a painter's brush, each stroke a lullaby in iron and pigment that continues long after letters. Footsteps and questions have settled into the quietest shade of all. You might not expect the precise distance between a nobleman's elbow and the communal salt cellar to have sparked 3 centuries of whispered controversy, yet here we are. If you remain awake long enough for me to utter the phrase parsley border protocol, feel free to subscribe, though falling asleep mid-lecture is widely considered the highest compliment in these quarters. The first recorded guidelines emerged from a dim candlelit feast in Bruges, circa 1328, where scribes noted that the salt, nestled in a tiny silver boat, must rest exactly 2 thumbs from the host's trencher. Those thumbs, incidentally, belonged to Baron Hendrik the Fretful, so named because he worried his napkin fringe into dust before dessert. His steward measured with a wooden caliper carved to resemble a praying carp, probably symbolism about humility, though carp seldom prey and even less frequently supervise condiments. Guests were advised to dip sparingly, 3 grains for blessing, bread, 5 for boiled beef, any more deemed immoderate sparkle. One monk observed that counting grains slowed conversation to a slumberous pace, ideal for contemplation or, indeed, gentle dozing. By 1400. The salt position had drifted westward on the average table by roughly 2 finger widths, prompting parchment, treatises on whether that shift indicated moral laxity or simply longer arms. In Parisian households, fashion dictated the cellar be shaped like a miniature fortress, complete with crenellations to protect the purity within. A knight of dubious repute attempted to storm the fortress with a bread lance, toppling the turret. Into stew, the resulting splash plotted a constellation upon 3 tunics, interpreted by a court astrologer as an omen that Mars favored moderation. Nobody risked bread lances thereafter, and poets penned couplets praising salt and stillness, lines now cited by sleep therapists as exemplary yawn inducers. If your eyelids hesitate, picture those tiny stone battlements standing guard. Over a pinch of sodium history's least thrilling soldiery, the Renaissance introduced geometry. In Florence, architects drafted seating diagrams where each diner formed a perfect polygon around the salt, asserting that harmony of angles fostered harmony of digestion. One such plan involved a 17-sided heptadecagon, a shape easier to observe than pronounce. Servants spent entire afternoons adjusting chairs by the width of olive pits, only for guests to shuffle them back while smoothing their festoons. Notes from a surviving ledger described the atmosphere as calmly exasperating, a phrase applicable to many Renaissance innovations, trousers included. The ledger also lists 21 synonyms for crimson wine stains, 7 now lost to linguistics but preserved as illegible. Blots sleepy hieroglyphs awaiting no decipherment. Across the North Sea, English manuals of 1532 insisted the salt be elevated on a pedestal, lest lesser folk mistake its dignity. Pedestals ranged from carved oak to glazed earthenware painted with mottos such as "Season Softly." One surviving specimen bears the enigmatic inscription, once the herring, possibly an in-joke regarding brine. Scholars argue about it still, though only when caffeine is abundant. Contemporary observers remarked that lofty salt cellars created treacherous shadows, causing guests to misjudge distances and scatter. Crumbs like mild snowfall. A bishop attending Queen Jane Seymour's confinement banquet allegedly missed his trencher entirely, seasoning the tablecloth instead. The cloth was later folded, preserved, and miscatalogued as a relic of minor importance, which in a way it is thought microhooks drift by like the German practice of passing the salt anti-clockwise to imitate celestial motion. The Polish superstition that clinking spoon against salt summoned distant geese, or the Venetian edict permitting only mirrors, never candles, to illuminate the salt after sundown, lest fire reflect envy. Each nugget glitters briefly, then settles back into the soft. Dunes of minutia. In Basel, a guild of spoon polishers petitioned to engrave incremental volume markings on salt spoons, so diners could boast of precision. The petition failed, but one prototype spoon survives, its tiny numerals barely visible perfect for straining eyesight and thoughts alike. If you're still with me, remember to breathe as slow as a pewter lid descending on a spice casket. 17th century. Etiquette books thicken like reluctant porridge. One London edition devoted 12 pages to the modest angle of wrist while salting. Illustrations depict a hand hovering over mutton, index finger poised as if blessing a sleepy congregation of peas. Experts recommended an angle of 23 degrees. Any steeper risked ostentation, any shallower implied miserliness. Measurement required a pocket inclinometer, small brass arcs lined in vellum, sold at fairs beside quack nostrums for melancholy. Owners rarely consulted them more than once, yet the mere possession signaled rigorous manners. In the hush of banquets, you might hear the soft clink of an inclinometer sliding across linen, followed by a sigh, perhaps satisfaction, perhaps resignation. The sigh reportedly kept tempo with the ticking of wall clocks and, by happy coincidence, with the breathing of listeners lulled by gentle recital. Meanwhile, Ottoman envoys visiting Vienna carried salt in tiny silk pouches, scattering pinches in geometric patterns resembling script. Local hosts, eager to reciprocate, embroidered tablecloth borders with looping salt trail motifs, unaware that the shapes spelled no words, at all merely doodles invented for politeness, yet rumors spread of hidden meanings. Cryptographers spent candlelit nights mapping crystals as if plotting star charts, only to concede that randomness often masquerades as code. Their published confession, entitled Apologies to Sodium, sold poorly but endures in archives, pages crisp as winter bread. Scholars reading it today seldom reach page 3 before eyelids flutter. If you feel a similar flutter, consider yourself in Distinguished Company Dot by 1690. The great debate had cooled, replaced by quiet consensus. Salt would reside midway along the lateral axis of the table, equidistant from monarch and minstrel, symbol of impartial favor. A Swedish designer invented a revolving stand so the cellar could spin languidly like a planet on predictable orbit. Guests tapped it to set motion, watching grains shimmer under chandeliers fashioned from Baltic glass tiny galaxies within. A measured revolution. The spinning ceased eventually, as all things do, leaving salt precisely where needed and conversation drifting where convenient. Observers describe the sight as time wearing a powdered wig. One cannot improve upon that metaphor, so I shall merely sigh contentedly in its shade. A final, nearly forgotten footnote. Toward the century's close, French savants experimented with electrostatic attraction, rubbing amber rods to draw salt upward in delicate fountains. They hoped spectacle might enliven otherwise drowsy suppers. Records claim the effect impressed 2 children, terrified a lapdog, and left everyone else politely unmoved. The apparatus found second life as a hat stand, while the concept dissolved like salt itself. Even novelty tires, when sprinkled too freely, immoral, perhaps, or simply another grain in history's cellar, and so we fade from grandeur to ordinary. Habit. Modern shakers rattled with holes arranged in Morse code nobody deciphers. Little paper packets clutched beside napkins of recycled fiber. Silent ceramic keepers on cafeteria trays reflecting fluorescent calm. Yet beneath each unremarkable pinch lies this lineage of thumb widths, wrist angles, and whispered planetary spins. I pronounce them here not to rouse, but to wrap you soft as linen, bland as brine, in a comfortingly tedious narrative. Let the rhythm of centuries drift through you like slow-falling salt, settling over thoughts until every edge is seasoned with drowsy forgetfulness. And should sleep overtake you now, know that etiquette committees everywhere would applaud. Then pause exactly 23 degrees mid-clap, so as not to startle the dreamer. You may not expect the faint crackle a postage stamp makes when you bend it ever so gently in lamplight to have kept civil servants awake for an entire century. But here we are. If you're still conscious by the time I begin discussing the hygroscopic habits of gum Arabic, you are most welcome to subscribe, though the highest praise, untold, is the soft snore of an audience lost to sleep midway through postal chemistry. It begins. As most unhurried tailies do, with an 1850s clerk in London, weighing paste in a brass scale polished dull by decades of thumbprints. His task was neither heroic nor hazardous. Combine 1 ladle of powdered gum with 2 ladles of lukewarm water. Stir with a goose quill until the mixture resembled thin porridge, then brush it onto the reverse of the 1-penny red. Legend says he hummed sea shanties so slowly that co-workers insisted time itself stretched between verses. One curious apprentice, counting drips from the brush, noted that a drop fell every 7 seconds, an interval now replicated by some meditation apps, though they claim cosmic inspiration rather than postal bureaucracy. As drying racks lined the corridor, stamps curled like shy ferns before flattening into obedient rectangles, each carrying just enough tact to cling to an envelope, yet not enough to offend a dignified tongue. The balance was crucial. Nobody wanted correspondence that tasted of barn glue dot by 1873 miner. Panic arrived in Paris when summer humidity transformed perfectly prim postal sheets into sticky mosaics. A startled postmaster discovered 2 love letters, fused awkwardly back to back, requiring a razor, a sworn affidavit, and 3 polite apologies to separate them. French chemists convened under a fig tree, perhaps for shade, perhaps because figs remind people that stickiness can be charming. They concluded the answer lay in dextrin, a starch derivative made from heating corn until it forgot it was corn. Dextrin dried matte, a texture poets compared to desert moonlight. One such poet devoted 14 stanzas to a single unused stamp. The poem ends abruptly, either because he fell asleep or because the stamp slipped quiet into a drawer that nobody ever opened again. Micro fact: dextrin formulas were stored in blue labeled bottles to reduce confusion with identical brown labeled bottles of cough tonic, though at least one clerk inverted the labels and mailed 20 letters that tasted faintly of peppermint. Relief. Across the Atlantic, American postal authorities pursued maple syrup experiments, suspecting national sentiment might favor a hint of breakfast on correspondence. Field tests revealed ants gathering on rural mailboxes in celebratory clusters, leading to friendly but firm rejection of the idea. Instead, clerks pivoted to fish glue distilled from sturgeon swim bladders, a process so aromatic it required production sheds at safe distance from human noses. Diaries from Michigan mention afternoon breezes carrying notes of optimistic puddle, a phrase simultaneously vague and unforgettable. If you find your mind drifting, picture a breeze moving through ranks of drying stamps, each exhaling the gentlest reminder of riverbanks and bureaucracy. By 1904, the German Empire introduced a standard known as Tablin Klebstoff Nummer 3, or TK3, which specialists measured with devices called tachometers, brass dials that evaluated how decisively a strip of birch bark adhered to the sample gum. A perfect score meant the bark resisted removal until a small sigh escaped the operator's scientific objectivity, allowing, of course, for occasional weary sighs. During demonstrations, the tachometer needles swung just far enough to reassure accountants, but not so far as to excite journalists. One visiting newspaper man described the sight as deliciously unremarkable, inadvertently coining a phrase that now adorns a handful of niche stationery blogs. Casual reminder: should your eyelids flutter, let them. The tachometer is patient. The First World War interrupted supply lines, prompting Britain's GPO to improvise with potato starch collected from barracks kitchens. Soldiers reportedly licked letters home and tasted echoes of Thursday stew, a comfort or a nuisance depending on the stew. Post-war reforms then produced the celebrated neutral flavor adhesive of 1922, guaranteed to evoke no sensation whatsoever. Pamphlets proclaimed, "Not sweet, not sour, simply secure," a slogan so understated it won a small award from the Society for Temperate Advertising. Scientists achieved neutrality by blending gum arabic, acacia resin, and a whisper of clove. Oil just enough to mask contaminants, not enough to conjure memories of winter biscuits. In blind trials, 87% of participants reported tasting hardly anything at all, while the remaining 13% couldn't be bothered to answer. Meanwhile, the Dutch experimented with ultraviolet indicators, sprinkle minute crystals of quinine into the gum so that postal inspectors, armed with violet lamps, could verify authenticity on sleepless midnight rounds. The crystals tasted like unsweetened tonic water, causing a generation of letter writers to smack lips in puzzled contemplation, unsure whether they disliked the sensation or merely recognized it too faintly. Ultraviolet lamps hummed like distant beehives, casting soft halos on the inspector's spectacles. One could imagine those halls as silent monasteries where monks transcribed the gospel of quiet adhesives. Curiously, the quinine crystals also glowed when someone whispered secrets. Near them, at least, that was the rumor spread by an enterprising inspector hoping to deter gossip. Whether true or not, the crystals kept glowing, secrets or no, and the rumor itself became another layer of invisible glue binding folklore to fact dot in the 1930s. Japan introduced rice-based paste with ceremonial precision, each batch granted a poetic name such as Snow Silent Gum or Dawn Miss Bond. A master blender would watch steam rise from copper vats while tapping a bamboo clapper at intervals, believed to align the solution's molecules into tranquil formation, a theory, unsupported by physics but warmly endorsed by tea house anecdote. Samples traveled to philatelic exhibitions in silk-lined boxes, where collectors inhaled their faint aroma, nodding appreciatively at notes of hay, ink, and afternoon rain. One enthusiast fell asleep beside a display case and, upon waking, insisted he'd dreamed an entire opera about postage chewing gum. Critics remained divided on whether the opera was any good. The libretto, scribbled on ticket stubs, features a chorus of envelopes singing the word Adhere 97 times. Perfect, really, for those pursuing gentle oblivion. World War II rationing forced yet another pivot. Synthetic polymers rolled in from laboratories, promising longer shelf life and zero food value. Polyvinyl alcohol led the charge, a clear, almost glassy layer brushed onto sheets by machines, emitting a steady thrum reminiscent of distant thunder muffled by drapery. Early prototypes bordered on too effective people complained of losing envelopes to accidental permanent bonding. A memo circulated advising correspondents to lick once lightly, as though greeting an acquaintance, not twice as though sealing. A pact with destiny. Such prose brightened office bulletin boards until someone spilled tea, the stain blooming like a continental outline, perhaps Antarctica, floating over an advisory about prudent tongue pressure. The stain was never cleaned, likely because nobody wished to rub away an accidental map by 1950. The matter seemed settled. A quiet Swiss consortium produced adhesive Formula 88, a blend of food-grade dextrin, trace ethanol, and a nearly mythical stabilizer labeled Ixlac, whose composition remains politely undisclosed. Formula 88 promised optimal tack at 45%, relative humidity, and retained elasticity down to freezing. Tests involved chilled rooms, reluctant volunteers, and stopwatch timing of envelope droop. Observers wore mittens to record data, pencils protruding like tiny antennae. When results proved satisfactory, they marked each chart with a circle, then circled the circle, creating gentle spirals of approval bureaucratic mandalas no one intended, but everyone found soothing to behold. Some reports show faint coffee, rings intersecting the spirals, lending the impression of planetary systems in slow orbit around a sun of regulatory calm. Should your mind orbit likewise, let it trace those rings until trajectory dissolves into drift. And so we coast into the modern era, where self-adhesive stamps have rendered licking optional, though not obsolete for the nostalgic. Contemporary formulations rely on pressure-sensitive acrylics, engineered to grip at a polite press of the thumb. Chemistry happens quietly at room temperature. No humming vats, no clove oil ghosts, just invisible polymers locking arms like shy dancers. Some lament the loss of ritual, yet others find comfort in the silence. Remember, under fluorescent post office lights, new stamps still yield the barest whisper when peeled from backing, a micro sound akin to closing a paperback page by page. Listeners who capture that whisper on audio call it the sigh of correspondence, looping it for relaxation videos most never finish because sleep intercedes first. If wakefulness lingers, ponder the overlooked footnote of micro-perforations, the tiny holes separating stamps calibrated so a single row equals. The space a polite yawn occupies in polite conversation. That, at least, is my own unscholarly measurement, yet I find it sufficiently dull to test even the stubbornly alert. Imagine rows of sleepy perforations marching like ghost footfalls across a sheet destined to be forgotten, a drawer whose handle sticks ever so slightly on humid mornings. In that drawer, adhesive formulas past and present mingle in gentle darkness, dreaming of envelopes not yet written, of postmarks blurred by drizzle, of hands slipping them into letterboxes freed at last from ants, peppermint, or any flavor. At all save the faint taste of history, unhurried, unglamorous, reliably bland. Let these notions settle over you like the lightest gum film, bonding eyelids to rest, sealing thoughts in calm suspension, until even the whisper of a spinning tachometer feels miles away and utterly irrelevant. Tomorrow's mail will travel without haste. Tonight your mind drifts where adhesives once mattered, now mattering only enough to guide you softly toward sleep. You might not think an unbroken loop of bent wire could inspire international conferences, midnight ledger checks, or a brief spat about the proper shade of corporate gray, but here we are. If you're still conscious by the time I whisper the tinsel strength of no two steel, feel free to subscribe, though falling gently asleep mid-sentences, of course. The highest compliment a narrator of paperclip history can receive. Hour. Drift begins in 1867 with Samuel B. Fay, a New York printer who filed the first American patent for what he called a ticket fastener. Fay's fastener looks suspiciously like the modern paperclip, although his intention was to affix tiny tags to bolts of fabric, not keep correspondence tidy. Early prototypes were bent by hand on a maple cutting board that rocked slightly when pressed, so rhythmic clack-clack accompanied each bended lullaby in wrought iron. Clerks reported the sound reminded them of distant carriage wheels on cobblestones, which made them drowsy at their desks long before any paperwork required clipping. Fay's design languished in catalogs between collapsible hat racks and adjustable boot trees. It sold slowly, not because it performed badly, but because people found tying string more reassuring. The way some now find comfort in wrapping headphone cables, despite Bluetooth's quiet pleas for attention. By 1899, the Norwegian Johan Baller produced his own variant, notable mainly for lacking the inner turn that grants modern clips a certain S and a P. Legend insists Baller's prototype was so listless it slid off documents if someone breathed nearby, a feature accidentally aligning with our current objective of soft distraction. Patent drawings reveal delicate shading that must have taken hours' time, perhaps better spent adding that missing inner loop, but hindsight is a restless critic. The Baller clip nonetheless entered local stationery cupboards where teachers used them to mark passages in geography texts describing fjords already visible outside the window. Students, lulled by overlapping curves of dull metal, practice unbending them into fragile S-shapes, an activity only slightly more exciting than watching moss advance across a stone. Those S-shapes would tarnish in pockets and re-emerge as accidental souvenirs of lectures half remembered. Across the North Sea, Britain's gem manufacturing debuted the design we now simply call the gem. Early advertising praised its non-tearing hold and gentle friction, two words that seldom headline hero stories, but do rather nicely for bedtime inventory. Factory inspectors measured clip diameter with calipers whose jaws closed in slow ceremonial taps. The caliper's faint clicks echoed across assembly halls larger than some cathedrals, yet devoted entirely to guiding wire along spindles, spiraling into perfect symmetry. One visitor likened the process to watching snails race in observation. That, if anything, exaggerated the velocity involved. The wire itself arrived on wooden reels bound in wax paper. Unspooled, it remembered forest breezes caught between bark and varnish, then forgot again when coaxed into endless series of bends. Workers claimed they could smell pine resin if the afternoon sun warmed the reels just so. Perhaps that was invention, or perhaps resin truly does linger. The way nostalgia hides in museum drawers. Americans responded with the ideal. A clip boasting sharper angles for a firmer grip. Testers suspended stacks of 50 sheets, timing how long before the paper slid free. Results were recorded on clipboard secured by what else larger clips. One anxious engineer feared infinite regress. Clips on clipboards holding clip data referencing clips. His supervisor assured him infinity would stop once the coffee break bell rang, and indeed, it always did. During those breaks, engineers discovered a new pastime, twiddling two clips together to make a squeaky hinge, reputedly useful for warding off crows outside the lunch shed. A memorandum warned against excessive squeaking during accounting audits. Apparently, numbers skew slightly when accompanied by metallic chirps. Even so, some copies of that memo were themselves pinned by squeaky hinge pairs, proof that rules. About clips are best clipped loosely. On the continent, French firm Papercom introduced a stovepipe-shaped clip nicknamed Le Somnambule for its tendency to shift position overnight under the weight of nothing at all. Scientists alleged thermal expansion. Poets suggested the clips went walking. One December, an entire shipment migrated from the center to the edge of a warehouse shelf, precisely 8 centimeters, as if inching toward a window view of the Seine. Night guards filed reports describing soft metallic rustles, like silver grass in wind, later determined to be settling boxes. Still the rumor remained. Clips now wanderlust. If your mind chooses to wander with them, follow at leisure, no hurry, no destination, just the quiet scrapings of tiny journeys. World War II metals shortages birthed experimental substitutes. In Canada, birch veneer was sliced into slats and bent into wooden clips secured by minuscule copper staples. They smelled faintly of campfire and damp notebooks. Soldiers tucked ration coupons beneath them and, in more sentimental moments, pressed leaves from foreign hedgerows. The wood swelled in rain, cracked in sun, and returned to earth in compost heaps, leaving dark impressions on paper like polite farewells. Meanwhile, Sweden trialed cellulose acetate clips transparent as glacier ice. Postal clerks loved their invisibility until misplaced letters multiplied. Invisible clips excel at hiding. An anxious directive ordered clerks to mark them with dots of fountain, panic, and inefficiency so thorough that metal supplies were soon restored out of sheer administrative exhaustion. By the 1950s, automation ascended. The Superclip 2000 machine straightened, bent, counted, and boxed clips while emitting a hum pitched precisely between a refrigerator and a lullaby. Engineers monitoring gauges sometimes nodded off against control panels, dreaming of sinuous wire weaving through gears like a patient river. Production logs grew immaculate machines rarely make spelling errors, but margins filled with doodles of serpentine loops, the human hand echoing the metal's path. One supervisor calculated that a single 8-hour shift produced enough clips to encircle Trafalgar Square if laid end to end. He never tried. Imagining the circle was quieter than ordering traffic diverted. At trade fairs, companies competed. And clip towers, stacking units into precarious columns. A record of 3,142 clips stood for 23 minutes before settling into gentle collapse. A drawn-out whisper of slides and sighs that spectators found oddly satisfying. Someone suggested broadcasting tower falls as late-night radio, the perfect antidote to insomnia. Negotiations stalled when networks realized listeners might drift off before advertisements. Still, prototypes exist, 10-minute recordings, where a host murmurs weight statistics until the tower descends like rain on tin roofs. You can practically feel the pages loosening, the whole world unclipping itself. Plastic arrived in the 1970s with citrus-colored loops that gripped too tightly, often tearing corners. Users complained, then shrugged. Bright orange against gray. Filing cabinets offered a welcome spark. Secretaries arranged plastic clips by gradient, creating dusk rainbows visible only after hours when overhead lights dimmed but never truly darkened. Cleaning crews paused to admire the spectrum, then moved on, leaving each color exactly where it rested, a small courtesy to the alphabet of dull days. Those same clips now fade in archival boxes, their petrochemical sheen mellowing like sunset preserved under glass. The box lids close with the faintness of library breath, sealing decades inside a hushed dot, and here we linger. Contemporary desks littered with variants bearing ridges, serrations, even ergonomic thumb rests. Yet the classic gem endures 2 loops. Mild steel, zinc-coated against the rust of damp office plants. Your fingers know its promise: press, slide, release, forget. Consider how a single clip can lie dormant for years within manila folders, then emerge spotless, still capable of modest service. There is comfort in such loyalty, a tiny oath of order whispered by curved wire. Now, should you wish to let eyelids settle, picture a factory at shift change. Conveyor slow, wire rails stop, and tens of thousands of freshly bent clips rest nose to tail on a belt the color of moonlit asphalt. The silence that follows rings almost musical, like the after chime of a distant clock acknowledging no hour in particular. In that silence, you might sense the gentle weight of unused clips wherever your papers lie, promising they will keep thoughts gathered, yet never protesting if those thoughts disperse into sleep. Let them. Let yourself. Tomorrow the clips will still be here, quiet custodians of nothing urgent ready to resume. They're looping vigil the moment someone remembers where they left off. You might be surprised to learn that the soft thud of a brass ring against oak once determined how quickly a pot of tea would cool on the other side of the door. Yet here we linger on the subject of 18th century English door knockers. If you're still awake when I reach the bit about provincial bylaws on knocker circumference, feel free to press the subscribe button with all the urgency of a sleepy thumb, or let it wait until morning. These knockers have been patient for centuries. Our gentle meander begins in 1703. When a surveyor in Bath listed household fixtures as part of a new property tax ledger. Among chimney pots and boot scrapers, he noted a ring of hammered iron affixed before entrance, priced at 1 farthing. The clerk spelled it knacker, possibly napping mid-quill stroke. Records show that most rings were forged from leftover cartwheel strapping. Blacksmiths heated the strip, wrapped it round a barrel stave, and tapped the seam closed with a mallet whose handle squeaked like a door in need of itself. The finished ring cooled on a windowsill, gathering tiny beads of dew that hissed off at dawn. Visitors reported the sound of iron on oak resembled a muffled church bell enough to stir housemaids, yet not jolt them. The way a cat's tail might flick you awake rather than a full feline pounce. Some owners draped knitted sleeves over the ring on Sundays so the Sabbath would remain acoustically reverent. The sleeves looked like mitten without thumb, a garment for door furniture too shy for bare metal. By the 1740s, artisans in Birmingham introduced lion head backplates, a motif lifted from imported firebacks, but rendered in softer relief. These lions appeared more resigned than regal, as though half yawning at the prospect of yet another parcel from the apothecary. Casting molds were reused to exhaustion. Careful eyes can still spot the faint ghost of previous pours' tiny air bubbles, resembling freckles on each leonine muzzle. Housewives kept a pot of beeswax by the entry to polish noses to a honeyed shine, claiming it discouraged rust and visitors alike. Apparently, a glistening snout felt too grand for casual callers. In rainy months, water pooled in the lions' lower lip, forming a miniature reflecting pool where spiders paused to drink. Children dared each other to taste the water for luck. Contemporary diaries note the flavor as unspecified tin. The fad spread until an Exeter alderman proposed a limit of 3 lion knockers per street to prevent metallurgic monotony. Debate lasted 2 evenings, during which attendees doodled sleepy lions in the margins of council minutes. Elsewhere, the town of Norwich experimented with acoustics. Merchants there preferred quick turnovers, so knockers were adjusted for maximum. Resonance longer shanks, thinner rings, sharper impact. An enterprising bell founder even tuned sets in thirds and fifths, so neighboring doors rang complementary pitches, turning alleyways into slow carillons whenever mail arrived. Residents either loved the accidental music or learned to ignore it, the way we now ignore refrigerator hum. One visitor described hearing D minor every time a fishmonger's ledger came due. To measure loudness, the local vicar stood 15 paces away and counted heartbeats between knock and echo, a method scientifically useless but marvelously calming. At dusk, he reported the sound merging with pebbles tossed at river trout, suggesting that commerce and nature share a rhythm when listened to half-dash asleep. Not all experiments thrived. A brief craze for glass knockers promised elegance, but delivered spider vein cracks in the first frost. Owners wrapped them in scraps of linen at night, producing door mummies that startled lamplighters and sheltered earwigs. An insurance agent classified glass knockers as ornaments, not instruments, refusing claims for broken ones and thereby ensuring their swift extinction. Surviving shards now rest in museum drawers beside mislabeled pottery and unused catalog cards quiet company for fragments of intentions. Towards 1775, the celebrated architect Robert Adams specified discreet oval knockers for a row of London townhouses. Fashionable diaries praised their whispering report, ideal for genteel callers who disliked announcing errands. Servants were instructed to stand in vestibules at specified intervals, whistling for faint taps like raindrops on gloves. One butler allegedly trained his ear so finely he could identify which oval by tone alone, proving that even monotony can foster expertise when offered decades and a chair. The downside emerged in winter when wind rattled shutters and imitated those whispers, sending footmen on false errands up and down unheated stairs. Some were counting beads to mark wasted trips, slipping into an arithmetical trance broken only by cocoa deliveries. Industrial reality arrived with the cheap post of 1,796. Letters multiplied, and sturdy efficiency trumped artistry. Factories stamped malleable brass into shapes resembling stylized urns, symbolic, perhaps, of the slow burial of bespoke craft beneath bulk orders. Packages thudded against broader plates now screwed directly into brick. The screws, incidentally, display a lovely accidental gradient. Early soft iron screws darken first, later steel ones keep a pewter glint, telling time by oxidation the way lichens stripe a gravestone. Householders ceased polishing altogether. Soot from coal fires provided a matte finish free of charge. Visitors, meeting less resistance, knocked harder out of habit, so the net decibel level remained steady. Progress is frequently a circle across. The Channel Parisian ateliers, determined to retain flair, adopted miniature hand-shaped knockers called portes baume. Cast fingers clasped the ball that struck the plate with a coy kiss. Etiquette guides advised 2 light taps for acquaintances, 3 for business, and none at all if bearing rumors. Locksmiths repaired chipped fingertips with lead solder, giving some hands the look of manicured gloves, others of patched farm. Tools. After the Revolution, several hands were discreetly removed to erase royal insignia, leaving empty studs that rested like freckles, a historian once called the punctuation of abandoned messages. That historian eventually confessed the phrase made him yawn when reread, which he deemed proof of scholarly neutrality. Back in Britain, the 19th century letterbox quietly dethroned the knocker. Carpenters cut modest slots below existing. plates. The very tools that once bored keyholes now swallowed correspondence whole. Knockers lost purpose, yet remained fixed, a polite redundancy. Some were painted the same color as doors, fading into background like forgotten verses of childhood rhymes. Others survived as towel hooks for visiting umbrellas, their lion heads, sniffing damp wool instead of autumn air. Maintenance manuals suggested a single yearly oiling, lest squeaks disturb infants or ailing grandparents, anchoring the devices firmly in the realm of hush. Even in retirement, they proved serviceable. To imagination, a late Victorian spiritualist floated the idea that dormant knockers captured echoes of significant events, acting as passive phonographs. He claimed to hear distant cannon through a clip-on stethoscope, though skeptics suspected nearby delivery. Carts. Still, the notion inspired amateur seances wherein participants pressed ears to cold metal, listening for ancestral grocery lists or confessions of ill-stored jam. The silence they encountered was profound, a cushion for wandering thoughts, and many reported excellent sleep afterward, an unexpected endorsement for our present aims. Today, heritage enthusiasts catalog surviving knockers with tender precision. They document dent patterns, calculate ideal swing arcs, and measure how far a lion's tongue protrudes in microns. One volunteer confessed she sometimes forgets to write the numbers, preferring the moment just before impact when potential energy hangs like an unanswered question. She describes that pause as the quiet between ideas, a door inside the mind, waiting politely to be opened, or perhaps to stay closed just a little longer. So allow your own thoughts to hover there. A cool evening, a gently raised ring, the smallest. Hesitation, and then a tap absorbed by wood, plaster, quilts, and eventually by sleep itself. Should you waken later, the knocker will remain timeless and untroubled, ready to resume its leisurely vigil over letters, footsteps, and the restful hush that follows an inconsequential sound. You may not have lain awake wondering about the lifetime travels of a single quill-stroke caricature in the margin of a 14th century manuscript. Yet here we find ourselves politely eavesdropping on its leisurely adventures through vellum and time. If you're still conscious by the hour I reached the regulation of ink costs in 1287, feel free to subscribe, though the little drawing of a yawning monk in folio 56 quite understands if you forget. Our meandering begins in the scriptorium of Buryest Edmund's Abbey around 1312, where Brother Alwyn waited for fresh parchment to cure. Bored, he idly traced a miniature snail jousting with a helmeted rabbit beside a line on divine justice. The ink came from iron gall steeped overnight. Its soft russet tone darkened while he watched, as slowly as bread rises in a cold kitchen. He breathed on the wet lines to speed drying, producing a tiny bloom of warmth that must have felt like weather to the brand new snail. The Abbey librarian later scratched a faint noda beside this doodle, thereby sanctifying it as a memory aid proof that even whimsy can be filed under usefulness with the right flourish of authority. A century of copyists followed, each adding quiet embellishments. One left the ladder so the rabbit could descend into the snail shell for tea. Another painted speckles on the ladder rungs so they resembled biscuit crumbs. Marginalia spread like ivy, scratchy music stave tails from treble clefs became vines that looped round illuminated capitals, sprouting faces on every third flourish. A visiting French cleric sighed that English manuscripts smelled of barns and carnivals, but he kept reading anyway because the notes in the margins summarized sermons better than the Latin. Body text proof that an affectionate side comment often outshines its supposed master, rather like a cat claiming the warm chair intended for guest. By 1420 parchment makers in Flanders complained of ink blots seeping through, citing excessive idle sketches, which they tallied by holding pages to a window and counting silhouettes. They proposed thinner parchment, so blotting would discourage doodles, a policy as effective as banning lullabies to make children study arithmetic. Scribes simply pressed harder, etching grooves deep enough to cast shadows at sunset, turning marginal scenes into low relief sculptures. Pilgrims rubbed fingers over favorite figures, transferring oils that burnished surfaces to a quiet shine. Scholars now judge popularity by this accidental polish, calculating something like medieval readership metrics. The glossier the snail, the more weary hands it comforted during evening prayers dot outside the cloister. University students in Paris developed their own margin dialect. They drew tiny pointing hands, manicules, wearing fashionable cuffs to indicate main arguments. A cuff with lace meant strongly agree, while a plain cuff signaled tepid assent. Lecture notes thus resemble a glove shop in freeze frame, each index finger forever poised at irony or awe. Tutors tried deducting marks for decorative sleeves, but students retaliated by shortening lecture attendance, leaving professors to murmur into half-empty halls. The resulting quiet was so agreeable that one master secretly inked flamboyant cuffs into his own exemplar, a confession we know only because the manicule accidentally pokes his signature, a self-inflicted jab centuries later still tickling. Anyone who notices, our drift continues to the wool trading port of Bruges, where merchants hired scribes for account ledgers. Profit margins invited literal margins. Bookkeepers sketched bales, sprouting legs, and scuttling toward ferry docks. Visual puns on moving inventory. An audit in 1476 notes unaccounted creatures at foot of page, prompting the first known attempt to standardize corner space, 2 finger widths, neither more nor less. Compliance lasted a single season. Soon finger measurements stretched. Conveniently, on days when trade slowed, an early example of data inflation, only with doodles rather than decimals. A Senate clerk resigned over the matter, claiming ergonomic distress from policing creative knuckles. His unused quills were sold to a nearby tavern for writing ale recipes. The circle of ink remains tidy. Printing arrived in London by 1476, and typesetters, unable to resist blank gutters, inserted tiny florons between paragraphs. Readers mistook them for cues to imagine flowers, and so they did, scribbling stems and bees until margins resembled sleepy meadows. Printers protested wasted lead, yet secretly admired how sales rose when pages looked friendlier. One publisher added faint outline cats to encourage ownership scribbles, coining the phrase companionship typography. Surviving copies reveal cats progressively fattening across print runs, as if fed by public affection. A worn first edition shows the cat barely a line thick. By the 8th, it lounges voluptuously under a sonnet about moderation. Censors, naturally, eyed the practice. A 1539 royal injunction warned against unauthorized inserts or beasts that might harbor heresy. Inspectors leafed through texts, redacting marginalia with strokes so hasty they sometimes obscured chapter headings, but spared doodles by chance. One agent confessed he found the tiny drawings restful after pages of doctrinal scrutiny, admitting he occasionally added a mouse, so the cat would look entertained. His supervisor reprimanded him in the margin below, creating a nested commentary of discipline and delight layers we now peel back with magnifiers, like gardeners unearthing bulbs that never intended to see sunlight again. The 17th century introduced printed ruling, blue lines pre-drawn to tame spontaneous artistry. Yet the straight edges became highways for doodle traffic, wagons, processions, and once a whole siege engine trundled along the baseline of a political pamphlet. Satirists exploited the phenomenon, planting cartoon pickpockets lifting coins from the serif pockets of capital letters. The best surviving example lives in the Bodleian, where a microscopic burglar steals the bar from an H, diminishing the word honor to honor with comic precision, the paper equivalent of a muffled snicker. Curators display it under gentle light, noting visitors lean in and, quite unintentionally, lower their voices. As literacy spread, so did household almanacs and margins filled with weather records, rain with beetles at noon. Some entries drift into dreamy shorthand. A lone spiral might signal a windy market day, or perhaps the scribbler simply felt the sky spin after cider. Historians compare these curls to tree rings, gauging economic health by doodle thickness fat. Spirals mean prosperous harvest, thin ones suggest caution. The theory may be bogus, but the spirals keep turning softly under archival glass, hypnotic as steam rising from porridge. During the long Victorian evenings, railway commuters passed time by penciling portraits of fellow passengers onto newspaper borders. Etiquette frowned on direct staring, so artists look sideways, producing profiles that lean ever so slightly toward imaginary windows. Some finished faces remain anonymous, others bear hurried captions like "Man who smelled of coal." When trains lurched, lines jagged, giving everyone sympathetic tremors, modern collectors prize these shaky sketches for their inadvertent authenticity, claiming you can hear distant wheel clicks if you read them after midnight typewriting. And margin justification tightened space in the 20th century. Yet office workers still tucked doodles into memo corners, geometric mazes, sleepy dragons, endless cubes. Carbon paper multiplied the art, a quiet graffiti syndicate binding. Triplicate forms. Wartime censors permitted it morale, they said, so a bomber manifest might host a tiny dove alongside ammunition tallies, an improbable duet that somehow landed intact in national archives. A curator scanning microfilm once paused, noticing how the dove's wingtip aligns with the decimal point, as though balancing destructive tonnage on a feather. She described the finding in a footnote, concluding only that balance remains an aspiration. Digital documents threatened to vanish. Margins entirely, yet comment bubbles appeared, containing emoji cousins of the medieval manicule. Even blank desktops invite mouse, gesture doodles arcs of idle motion that vanish when released, like footprints in carpet fibers. Some software now offers a focus mode that hides toolbars, recreating the broad silence of vellum. Users respond by jotting notes on sticky pads, or, in one charming reverse, by printing pages solely to draw cats between paragraphs before scanning them back. Progress, like our earlier circle, prefers ellipses to periods. Archivists today photograph every stray line before conservation trimming. They catalog doodles under controlled terms: zoomorphic, geometric, uncertain intent. The last category grows fastest. Volunteers confess they love those unclassifiable marks. They resemble half-remembered dreams, the moment before a kettle sings. One retiree spent weeks tracing a single looping flourish, hypothesizing it depicted wind around nothing in particular. When asked why continue, she answered the loop felt endlessly preparatory. The way sleep feels just before it arrives. So rest now alongside these gentle scribblers. Picture a candle guttering, a quill hovering, a mind wandering from doctrine. To daydream, hear the faint scratch, softer than rain on slate, leaving a swirl that will outlast kingdoms yet never demand attention. Let that quiet persistence settle over you, ink darkening at its own pace, paper accepting without comment, and time itself curling in the margin, perfectly happy to be almost, but not quite, blank. You probably never measured the hush of a reading room by the flutter of a single paper slip. Yet the tiny library due date card has been quietly tapping shoulders of books for more than a century, asking them, ever so politely, to come home. If you manage to stay awake until it learns to complain in purple ink around 1954, you're welcome to subscribe or just let the card keep your place while you drift away. It begins in 1840s. Boston, when circulating libraries tied silk ribbons around ledgers to track returns. The ribbons frayed, knots tightened, and a chemise of pink lint drifted across polished counters. So Miss Eliza Winthrop snipped narrow scraps from catalog index sheets, tucked them inside covers, and penciled the date a fortnight ahead. Patrons were instructed to consult the inner lining for the book's memory. Early slips were hand-cut, edges softly ragged like crusts of toast. Some bore faint ghosts of earlier columns. Atlantic Phrenological Society reversed in pale mirror ink, so that years later, a reader of sentimental poetry might catch a sideways mention of cranial bumps and wonder what other lives the paper had lived. Printers soon offered dedicated reminder blanks. They supplied them in gentle buff, the color of cooled oatmeal, claiming it reduced eye strain even when lamp oil was cheap. To fit snugly, a card measured 3 by 1 and 3/8 inches, a dimension arrived at after an earnest clerk folded a matchbox 3 times and sighed contentedly. By 1872, railway libraries preferred stiffer stock, worried that looser cards would slip between carriages like travelers without tickets. Conductors found orphan blanks and slid them under hat bands as impromptu sweat guards. Thus, a dull relic of punctuality also toured the countryside, absorbing scenery and perspiration in equal measure. When rubber date stamps arrived, librarians rejoiced as though rain had fallen on dictionaries. The thump of a self-inking pad grew rhythmic, almost metronomic, and long cues shuffled forward in slow choreography. Borrowers reported the stamp's hollow thud lingered inside the book, audible only when pages rustled late at night, a reminder neither accusing nor forgiving, just present, like a cat noticing you're awake. Rules multiplied yet never shouted. They perched in 6-point type along the lower margin. A fine of 2 cents per day shall accrue. Someone calculated that if a volume of sermons overslept on a mantle 53 years, the penalty would exceed the cost of the library. Roof. They mentioned this in annual minutes, then quietly capped fines at $1, reasoning roofs could always be patched, but that well was priceless. In the 1920s, the card sprouted a pocket, stitched from manila thicker than breakfast cereal boxes. Early adopters pasted pockets crooked, creating tiny uphill climbs for the slit. Children tipped books upside down just to watch the flimsy rectangle toboggan down paper. One janitor in Des Moines swept 147 escapees in a month, claiming they flocked behind radiators like ticket stubs after a languid matinee. He returned them in a shoebox labeled Runaways, earning a quiet nod from the head librarian and a forever waiver on late fees. Around the same time, etiquette guides advised borrowers not to annotate cards with personal notes, a suggestion ignored with sleepy enthusiasm. Pencil scrawls confessed weather reports, budding romances, and once an inventory of jam flavors tried while reading Plum Good with Chapter 9. Scholars now treat these scribbles as sociological gold, though really they are just breadcrumbs left by wandering appetites. World War II rationed paper. Pockets shrank to the width of a tea bag label. Cards followed suit and adopted both sides, marching dates in 2 disciplined columns. The government asked patrons to return books promptly for troop education programs, so clerks inked patriotic slogans at the top. Books fight ignorance, return on time. Ironically, such slogans encouraged collectors to keep slips as souvenirs. One infantryman carried a card from the Pickwick Papers through Italy, punching a new hole for each town. Liberated, it returned decades later with a handwritten apology, overdue, though usefully occupied. The circulation desk waived fees, stamped the day's date, and lay shelved both card and note as a single, slightly heroic artifact. By 1965, fluorescing inks promised modern efficiency. They glowed under ultraviolet lamps, letting clerks scan. Due days like constellations across a countertop sky. Children queued eagerly to see their book cards shine, then left fingerprints that also gleamed, revealing clandestine cookie crumbs. This lively choreography of neon and smudge lasted until barcodes crept in, monochrome and dutiful. Early barcode stickers refused to adhere to cloth spines. They curled like shy millipedes. Technicians recommended heating the glue with a light bulb, inspiring several melted lampshades and at least one singed Shakespeare. Eventually, adhesive improved, and the date card began its long retirement, sometimes retained as a comfort object, sometimes cold in quiet stacks labeled ephemera, variable condition. Yet the humble slip never fully vanished. Little free. Libraries now host rescue cards, tucked back inside battered mysteries as bookmarks, each a mini novella of past reader schedules. Dentist March 14th, 81. Grandma Visit 3rd 29th. Taxa Zoo. An amateur archivist in Ohio arranges cards by ink color, arguing the spectrum from blue-black to timid mauve charts. National mood swings more subtly than stock indices. He may be right. At least no one disputes him, perhaps fearing citation from a 2-cent fine. Meanwhile, digital borrowing apps add animated check marks that fade like exhalations, but some users still print their records to tape inside covers, craving the tactile promise that a date, once stamped, will stick around to say farewell. So picture, if you will, a dusk-lit library aisle, a hush so thick even desk motes pause. A hand slides a book free, the pocket sighs, relinquishing its card. The slip trembles, stamped rows like tiny footfalls already marching home. Slots wait patiently, half filled with old departures and blank returns. The paper's faint woody scent drifting upward as lights dim. Let that quiet timetable settle beside your breathing. Dates blur, columns soften, ink feathers into evening, arranging itself into the simplest decree. Rest now, and whenever you wake, the book will still remember the way back. You may not have lain awake pondering the quiet destiny of a stubby, two-pronged perking meter key, yet here we are, turning it ever so gently in the city's collective pocket. If you're still conscious when the handle switches from brass to dull bakelite somewhere around paragraph 6, do feel free to subscribe or simply let the little key keep winding while your eyelids settle. The first of these miniature scepters appeared in Oklahoma City in 1935, forged from leftover lock, blanks ordered for courthouse windows that no longer opened. Each key was cut by a man named Elmer, who whistled only the second half of popular tunes, leaving melodies to trail off like misplaced commas. The key's teeth were modest, 3 notches, evenly spaced as though drafted by someone who distrusted flair. They turned a simple 4-tumbler core inside the perking meter, releasing the coin vault with a muted clink. Early city clerks discovered that on humid mornings the metal swelled a hair's breadth, so they warmed the keys in coffee mugs before their rounds. Some swore the aroma of chicory improved the lock's temperament, though no one proved it under. Laboratory conditions dot meters then sported little canvas aprons to catch rain, fastened with nickel snaps that tarnished inexpressive blotches, rather like continents forming on a classroom globe. Drivers, accustomed to seeing policemen drop chalk marks on tires, now watched meter men tuck canvas aside, insert keys, and tilt vaults into burlap bags. Coins chimed down like reluctant sleet. Occasionally, a dime wedged itself sideways, producing the faintest tink heard only by sparrows perched on trolley wires. The keyholder's job included a wooden dowel for nudging stuck coins. Dowels were sanded smooth by lunch boxes over years, taking on a buttery sheen that museums would later mislabel as factory polish. By 1942, wartime brass shortages forced municipalities to commission steel keys coated in zinc gray paint so thin it rubbed away during the first week, leaving palms dusted silver like stage magicians after a hurried trick. These austerity keys, as a trade journal yawned, were brittle in winter. A cold snap could snap them outright. One Minneapolis attendant, Mr. Bergen, broke 3 in a single block, finally opening meters with a knitting needle borrowed from a passerby who said she would be late to choir but happy to assist progress. Field reports recommended wrapping handles in friction tape black, sticky, smelling faintly of library paste. The tape amassed lint until each key resembled a tiny caterpillar that opened metal flowers only it could coax dot when peace returned. Aluminum gleamed in optimistic curves. The National Meter Company introduced Model the 10 keys with a gentle finger flange, marketed as effortless as a twilight breeze. Brochures depicted immaculate hands against rose-tinted backgrounds, though in practice grit accumulated in the flange groove, embossing fingertips with grime hieroglyphs. Some attendants carried nail brushes clipped to belt loops. Others simply accepted the charcoal manicure as a civic badge. Keys sprouted serial numbers too, 4 digits embossed so lightly they faded under the touch of a coin vault's breath. Clerks recopied numbers in ledgers, pressing harder each week, until paper bruised like overripe pears. Paint coats for meters shifted at nearly the same pace. Early domes were carriage red, a hue that argued politely with brick storefronts. Then mid-century planners fancied forest green, followed by aluminum flake, followed by a beige named municipal biscuit. Each color required a matching dab on key handles for quick identification. Inevitably, keys exchanged jackets during hurried shift changes, producing an amiable chaos. One vault might refuse a green-tipped key, yet accept a biscuit-tipped stand-in, suggesting locks themselves enjoyed mild mischief. A 1957 memo proposed universal blue, the shade of low-risk skies, but the recommendation languished in committee while keys kept their piebald coats, dunked daily in pouches smelling of pennies and sidewalk dust. Electronic meters threatened. The key's dominion in the 1960s, humming softly about solid-state reliability, yet even they required a slot for resetting circuits, and so arrived the transistor-era key, a flat, perforated wafer that looked like a postage stamp cut from a toaster. This key slid home with a plasticky sigh and, when withdrawn, carried a whiff of ozone as if it had briefly visited a thundercloud. Attendants now logged service calls on triplicate cards, one copy stapled to a clipboard, whose spring creaked like an old porch swing at every block. Drivers, meanwhile, adjusted to meters flashing crimson LEDs that spelled expired, a more strident declaration than the gentle flag that once merely read time. Yet amid the circuitry, the old cylinder keys endured, jangling in canvas. Satchels with buttons shaped like state capitals. A Baltimore mechanic modified his with a cork grip, claiming it cushioned moral fatigue. Others drilled tiny holes to lighten the swing, creating accidental whistles when wind funneled through at the right angle, so a summer breeze could play hesitant notes while they marched down the curve. Such serenades were seldom in tune, but nighttime garage crews said they preferred them to silence, which felt unfinished. Documentation grew thicker than meter posts. The International Brotherhood of Parking Device Custodians issued manuals totaling 642 pages, half devoted to key care. Chapter titles ambled: Seasonal Lubricant Application, Philosophical Considerations of Tumbler Wear, Appropriate, Responses to Curious Children. One appendix offered meditation exercises, envision the key as transition between chaos and order, though most users skipped straight to the grease charts. An informal survey found attendants spent more time sharpening pencils than turning locks, an outcome everyone accepted without comment, as if city symmetry required a surplus of points ready to press indentations across carbon paper. Retirement. For many keys came not with a clang, but with a cardboard box marked surplus, stowed behind fluorescent tubes in municipal basements. When eBay dawned, a few boxes resurfaced, selling for $8 a bundle to collectors of roadside Americana. They polished handles until numbers reappeared like shy comets, then arranged them under glass, labeling exhibits with leisurely captions. Unit 8732, likely open meters during the 1974 Oyster Festival note prongware. Museums of the ordinary sprouted in repurposed tool sheds, where visitors listened to recordings of long, extinct meter clicks, piped through headphones padded like faux velvet earmuffs. Some listeners described a peculiar relaxation, as though each tick hushed traffic a fraction more dot today. Successor smart meters glow teal, chirp over cellular waves, and authenticate via encrypted fobs that resemble tiny spacecraft. Yet a sliver of city blocks still host cast iron elders whose coin boxes will only ever trust a slotted key. On quiet mornings, you might see a veteran attendant unholster one, the metal dulled to a pewter calm, the grooves polished translucent. The key turns not with a click this time, but with a sigh, and the vault door swings like a patient confession. Quarter stacks glimmer, daylight stirs against their edges, and for a moment the street holds its breath, waiting to see whether time and its pocket-sized cage might rattle or simply purr dot, so lie back and imagine every slumbering meter along a drowsy boulevard, each containing minutes folded like napkins, each guarded by a key humble enough to live on a plain ring beside. Unremarkable cousins. Feel the slow rotation of that little shaft, the unhurried tumble of pins seating into place, the archaic yet earnest promise that for a nickel of attention, you might park your restless thoughts just long enough to drift. And if drowsiness arrives, before the next coin drops, well, the meter keeper will understand. After all, even the key itself needs pauses between turns, small silences in which metal can remember what peace sounds like. You might not think a single splinter from a walnut drawer could reveal the secret tempo of a city's reading habits. Yet every catalog card began exactly there, sliding over wood so quietly that the hush felt intentional. If you're still awake when we reached the moment librarians debated whether to hyphenate steam-powered, feel free to subscribe or let the drawers keep murmuring while you drift elsewhere. No checkout required. The very first catalog cabinets of note appeared inside the Boston Athenaeum in 1840, assembled by a carpenter who confessed he had never once finished a novel. He measured each drawer by the span from thumb to pinky of a portly trustee, ensuring that even gloved fingers could pluck the sturdiest cards without cramping. These early slips were cut from discarded ledger sheets, their faint blue rulings marching sideways so that novelists rubbed shoulders with municipal bond reports. Ink was iron gall, liable to brown over time. When humidity rose, titles ghosted across the backs of neighboring cards, causing phantom bibliographies that scholars later misread as lost works, whole treatises on the behavior of eels that never existed outside a damp drawer. During the 1870s, Melville Dewey, he of the famous decimals, insisted that each card measure precisely 7 1/2 by 12 1/2 centimeters, because round numbers, he said, lulled the intellect into complacency. Clerks wielded nickel-plated rulers to trim corners just so. Any deviation earned a mild sigh and relegation to the scrap pile, where children visiting on Saturdays used misfit cards as makeshift kites scudding along marble floors. Dewey also dictated one red guideline 3 millimeters from the top edge. The statement of responsibility line. Pens stuttered there, leaving littered constellations of ink droplets that modern forensic chemists can date within a decade. The way tree rings expose droughts. In Cleveland, the head cataloger believed red disturbed the piece of reference and substituted lavender ink that faded to a thoughtful gray. Her drawers, when opened today, exhale a faint scent of heliotrope, polite as a CURTCY dot as the 20th. Century yawned awake. Steel factories in Pittsburgh began stamping tiny rod brackets to stabilize card stacks against enthusiastic flipping. These rods, threaded through holes punched near the bottom margin, clinked like cutlery when someone searched for zoology cephalopods. On quiet afternoons, the music department staff claimed they could discern composers by listening to the rhythm of shuffling. Waltz, like for Strauss. Methodical for Bach. Utterly improvisational for Gershwin, whose subject headings sprawled like elbows across multiple drawers. Keys to the locking bars were issued on braided lanyards the color of oatmeal. A dropped key rang against the terrazzo. Floor with a tone pitched conveniently at middle C, useful for covert choir practice after hours. During the Great Depression, some libraries trimmed expenses by erasing obsolete cards with fine sandpaper rather than ordering new blanks. A thrifty exercise that left surfaces velvety and slightly concave, so ballpoints later skated downhill. Into the past tense, World War II disrupted cardstock supplies, diverting pulp to munitions manuals. Librarians resorted to repurposing cigarette cartons, slicing away foil liners, and stamping call numbers over faint images of camels and cheering sailors. Such makeshift cards curled in humid air, producing waves that jammed drawers mid-consultation. Patrons learned to wiggle them like loose teeth. In Minneapolis, an inventive assistant pressed each card between copies of Grey's Anatomy overnight, flattening both cartilage diagrams and catalog entries into obedient planes. By 1956, the Library of Congress operated a catalog card distribution service resembling a sleepy postal route. Truckloads of shoebox-sized packets rattled down Pennsylvania Avenue every dawn, delivering freshly printed cards nationwide. The truck's suspension creaked exactly 7 times between traffic lights, or so claimed a driver who composed haiku celebrating each bounce. Rural librarians waited weeks for their allotments, meanwhile drafting provisional cards in pencil. Many were never replaced, and today a surprising number of definitive Shakespeare references remain in the tentative handwriting of an Iowa substitute teacher who preferred green no. 2S dot automation loomed like a polite thundercloud. By 1971, punch-tape terminals produced cards with dot matrix headings, their letters formed of pinpricks resembling pixelated snowstorms. Traditionalists bewailed the loss of copperplate grace, yet some patrons praised the new sameness, finding in those evenly spaced dots a hypnotic murmur akin to distant lawn sprinklers. Drawer faces sprouted adhesive labels reading computer. Card, do not bend, an instruction largely ignored by gravity. Meanwhile, child patrons discovered that the punch holes along each card's left margin could serve as windows for finger puppets fashioned from paper clips. Quiet giggles drifted through the stacks like soft birdsong. The final great cabinet order, a battalion of honey-colored oak towers, shipped to Fresno in 1983, each drawer fitted with brushed aluminum pulls cool as pond stones. Installation technicians wiped every surface with lemon oil, leaving a gloss that reflected overhead fluorescence in wobbly rectangles resembling distant planets shimmering over heat haze. For a last brief season, the card catalog looked almost futuristic, just as the future prepared to abandon it. When OPAC terminals arrived, cabinets migrated to hallways, then to basements, finally to surplus auctions where artists repurposed. Drawers into planters, spice racks, or modular homes for very polite hamsters. Yet the cards themselves lingered in unlabeled cartons. Volunteers in Kansas City now stitched them into quilts, whose call number fragments form nonsensical lullabies. 641.8, pudding nestling against 291 angels, beside 973 reconstruction. One quilt, draped over a reading room couch, has lured more naps than any audiobook. Elsewhere, a Canadian sculptor stacks cards in spiraling towers sealed with archival glue. The towers narrow towards skylights, drawing breezes that flutter, edges like whispered page turns. During evening lectures, audiences swear they can smell the faint vanilla note that cellulose releases as it ages. The shy perfume of comfortable facts dot, so here we sit, drawerless, Yet the invisible alphabet still files itself somewhere behind the eyelids. Picture a single card, slightly yellowed, corners softened by 1,000 fingertips, call number aligned with calm purpose. It waits patiently for inquiry, not urgent, merely ready. Imagine sliding it forward, feeling the rod lift, hearing that sigh of expectation older than dial tones. You might read the author, or perhaps merely trace the ruled lines until the ink thickens into silence. Let that quiet orderliness repeat, card after card, title after humble title, until the sequence of facts becomes a lullaby of rectangles and ruled red tops, a gentle taxonomy of drowsiness. And if before you reach the letter Z, your thoughts misfile themselves into sleep, rest assured the drawer will close itself softly, reshelving dreams by subjects, subheading, and the peaceful certainty that nothing is ever truly misplaced for long. You might not expect the gentle width of an A4 sheet 21.0 soothing centimeters. Across to trace its ancestry back to a Bavarian mathematician's doodle, yet here we find ourselves, standing at the edge of a margin that decided how most of the world now writes grocery lists. If you're still awake when we reach the thrilling dispute over whether if 5 envelopes should seal on the long or short side, you're welcome to subscribe or merely let these rectangles drift past like mild clouds. Long before photocopiers yawned, worn toner onto fresh reams, medieval scribes confronted parchment that refused to be predictable. Goatskins stretched however they pleased, so margins meandered like sleepy rivers, and sermons spilled into ribbons at the bottom where the animal's tail once swished. Fast forward to 1794, when the French Revolution, eager to rationalize. Everything from calendars to curtains flirted with a grand register standardized at exactly 1 square meter. One could not conveniently tuck such optimism into a saddlebag, so the idea napped in a drawer until 1830, when physicist Georg Christoph, Lichtenberg's student, quietly noted that if a rectangle's sides were always in proportion square root 2, 1, folding it in half would yield a smaller rectangle of identical shape, a perfect fractal lullaby. Imperial bureaucrats, who loved nothing more than reducing paperwork by cutting it, saw promise in a sheet that could become 2 smaller but perfectly similar sheets. Ad infinitum, like nesting dolls who all share the same face. Thus the A series was born in sketches long before it gained a passport dot by 1922. Dr. Walter Porstmann shepherded these dreaming dimensions through the corridors of Berlin's standards, committee with the patience of someone waiting for glue to dry. Each size received a number AO, A1, a 2 descending like a gentle staircase where every landing has the area. O, grand enough to blanket a modest table, surrendered gracefully to a 1 for drafting blueprints, then to a 2 for posters announcing. Lost umbrellas, until finally the familiar A4 emerged, demure and employable. Printers sighed with relief. At last a sheet that slipped through rollers without wondering which edge to nibble first. Some skeptics argued the world already owned foolscap, letter, and legal. Porstmann countered by placing 3 piles side by side, inviting officials to observe how irregular corners jutted like restless elbows. The orderly A series, by contrast, sat flush, breathing evenly. Officials, lulled by symmetrical edges, signed off between sips of weak coffee. During the 1940s, Sweden's post office conducted a quiet experiment. Could the A series help sleepy clerks estimate postage by feel alone? They blindfolded volunteers, handed them envelopes, and asked them to guess destination cost. Results were inconclusive. Volunteers mostly requested cinnamon buns, but the test did cement as 6 as the default postcard. Petite enough to whisper hello, yet spare enough ink to avoid oversharing. Meanwhile, Britain clung stubbornly to its well-loved letter size, citing typewriter habits and the comforting rhyme of 8 by 10. In 1967, a compromise emerged. The British Standard A series, functionally identical to the German original but printed on thicker stock so it wouldn't feel too foreign. Even resistance can be politely measured. Office photocopiers of the 1980s, those beige domesticated rhinos, learned to detect A4 silently. A tiny optic sensor scanned for the steady 297 millimeters length, like a librarian recognizing an old friend. Across the reading room, malfunction lights flickered mostly for rogue legal paper, which jammed with dramatic crumples reminiscent of Shakespearean exits. Graphic designers embraced a 3 as a theatrical gesture large enough for storyboards, yet still foldable into a 4 brochures. A clever origami that massaged budgets. Somewhere around 1992, an Australian stationery supplier attempted to popularize A4, proposing it as the Goldilocks sheet for recipes. The idea enjoyed 3 catalog cycles before evaporating like steam from a saucepan. Few mourned its passing. As sizes prefer whole numbers, the lull of predictable halves. Digital age or not, printers still nudge stacks of paper with tactile sensors tuned to these placid proportions. The International Organization for Standardization, calm custodian of so many sleep-inducing metrics, updates the governing document ISO 216 every few years, mostly to confirm nothing has changed. Meeting minutes record long discussions about rounding tolerances that never exceed 1/10 of a millimeter. One delegate once suggested beveling the corners of the 1 sheets for safety. The proposal was tabled indefinitely, though the minutes fondly note his passionate demonstration using cardboard mock-ups and gentle shuffling sounds. In modern Tokyo, train conductors carry fold-out timetables printed on accordion creased as 7 to slip neatly behind ticket punches. Swiss watchmakers sketch gear trains on a 5 because its borders frame complications like a comfortable picture window. And in Nairobi, a startup recycles printing misfeeds into A8 seed packets, tucking marigold futures into the same geometry that once bore quarterly reports. The rectangle endures, quietly ferrying intentions from mind to hand to archive, shrinking or expanding like a polite concertina according to need. So imagine now a single pristine. A 4 sheet resting on a desk bathed in lamplight. It waits, balanced, perfectly between height and width, inviting a pen to stroll across its surface. Fold it once, there is a 5, eager yet composed. Fold again a 6, intimate as a whispered note. Continue until the layers thicken into a soft pillow of potential, and notice how the edges still align, as though even the creases respect a deeper order. Let your attention follow each fold, having worries with every gentle press, until thoughts settle into tidy stacks of possibility. Somewhere beyond the final crease lies a 10, too small for words, large enough for a dream. If eyelids grow heavy before you reach that invisible sheet, rest easy. Proportions will hold your place, keeping dimensions company in the dark, squared roots humming their quiet lullaby until morning turns the pages anew.